Large parts of this sermon quote two articles, one by Matthew Gannon from Salon magazine of September 4th, 2013, and the other by our own Unitarian Universalist Association president, the Reverend Dr. Susan Frederick Gray, in the UU World magazine from 4 months ago. The Gannon piece gives us the history of Labor Day, and the article from the UU World helps us to place the struggle in a UU context. There can be no doubt that Labor Day is a lapsed holiday in America. It was a once proud tradition celebrating, as the U.S. Department of Labor website puts it, the social and economic achievements of American workers, and a national tribute to the contributions workers have made to the strength, prosperity, and well-being of our country. From its roots in the 19th century, it has by the 21st century become an opportunity for barbecues, a much-needed 3-day weekend, and a convenient capstone for the summer season. The sacrifices, blood, and courage on the part of the workers that toiled, often in poor conditions for little to no pay, does not figure into our current understanding of labor movements in the United States. The lapsed state of Labor Day is surely indicative of the lapsed state of labor movements themselves, which have fallen by the wayside in American political rhetoric. Once strong labor organizations have been slandered. National statistics indicate that private sector union membership is at historic lows. Though only once a year, Labor Day once had the capacity to ignite hopes for workers that through efforts to organize and demand fairness, they could one day achieve justice. But times have changed. The holiday has been whitewashed and nearly scrubbed from the history books. The U.S. Department of Labor's own website provides a false depiction of the history of Labor Day by avoiding a discussion of socialism, corporate greed, and state violence against striking workers. The actual history of Labor Day is more complicated than the government's explanation that Labor Day was once a small-scale holiday that naturally grew in importance and gradually attained its federal status. America's Labor Day has roots in the Pullman strike of 1894. The main event that precipitated the strike was the Panic of 1893, a series of bank failures followed by a severe depression. The panic was largely caused by a railroad bubble, railroad overbuilding coupled with suspect financing. In the wake of the panic, demand for new passenger cars dropped, and the Pullman Palace Car Company cut wages for factory workers to compensate for the decreased revenues. Most workers who built Pullman cars lived in Pullman, a planned worker community set 14 miles south of Chicago. George Pullman, the factory owner himself, had designed the community and turned it into a profitable enterprise unto itself. To do so, however, he ran the town with a feudalistic authority, severely limiting the constitutional freedoms and sources of leisure and recreation for the town's inhabitants. A national commission sent to investigate after the Pullman strike called the town un-American. So when Pullman cut wages for workers, he characteristically did not lower rents in the town of Pullman. The workers simply could not suffer the decreased wages and the unaltered rent, so they organized a wildcat strike, since there was no existing union there. Nearly 4,000 factory workers walked off the job on May 11th, looking for an opportunity to make a political statement and strengthen labor rights. A young Eugene V. Debs, who was just beginning his long and illustrious labor organizing career, led the American Railway Union, the ARU, in signing up disaffected Pullman workers and formalizing their strike, despite resistance from powerful other labor organizations such as the Railroad Brotherhoods and the American Federation of Labor. The official boycott began the next month on June 26, 1894. And within days, roughly 125,000 workers on 29 railroads had showed their solidarity by refusing to handle Pullman cars. In the ensuing days, Pullman and other railroad companies around the country called in strikebreakers to replace the workers. A planned peaceful rally on June 29th in Blue Island, Illinois, hosted by Debs, in support of the strikers turned violent, with riots breaking out and angry workers destroying railroad property. Such outbursts occurred around the country wherever workers were refusing to handle Pullman cars, leading to roughly $80 million worth of damage to railroad property, an enormous sum for that era. This is over 100 years ago. Imagine what $80 million would look like today. These events made the strikes worthy of national attention, and President Grover Cleveland himself sided with Pullman and the railroad companies against the strikers. President Cleveland ordered a federal injunction that union leaders step down and cease their support for the strike. When Debs and the ARU refused to comply, federal troops were sent in to enforce the injunction. Thousands of U.S. Marshals and Army troops were sent to every city that had striking railway workers and reinstated railway traffic. In the ensuing struggles that took place, 30 people were killed and dozens more injured. In the aftermath of the event, workers known to have participated in the strike were blacklisted, while Debs was arrested and went to prison for violating the federal injunction issued by President Cleveland. Though public opinion was largely against the strikers, many unions did not even support it. There were heightened tensions after the scattered violence sown by the boycott. Labor organizations were fragmented, and numerous businesses and industrialists feared backlash by the workers, who were inspired by the actions of the strikers. In an effort to placate workers, President Cleveland and Congress quickly promoted the idea for a national holiday to celebrate workers across the country. Because of the state of anxiety among all parties involved, it took only 6 days for Congress to unanimously pass legislation to establish this federal holiday, which they called Labor Day. Kurt Vonnegut's novel Jailbird is his depiction of the strike. He calls the strike the Cuyahoga Massacre, writing that while it is an invention of his imagination, it is composed of bits taken from tales of many such riots in not such olden times. That the fictional strike and ensuing massacre takes place in 1894, as did the Pullman strike, is not the only indicator that it is a thinly veiled retelling of history. Vonnegut's Cuyahoga Massacre also takes place in the Midwest. His is set in Cleveland rather than Chicago. It is exacerbated by unfair rents in a nearby worker community owned by the factory. It involves a wildcat strike that blossoms to a larger strike around the country. Federal troops are sent in to quell the mass of workers, and the most unfortunate of inevitabilities, protesters are killed during the boycott. Of all his novels, Jailbird is perhaps Vonnegut's clearest articulation of sympathies with the labor movement. He writes autobiographically about his early involvement in the socialist movement, believing that unions were admirable instruments for extorting something like economic justice from employers. He recounts a time in which he met with Powers Hapgood, a famous labor leader and a masterful storyteller. In fact, Hapgood was late meeting the young Vonnegut because he had been testifying in court in favor of some labor movement, and the judge kept encouraging him to go on telling stories of his bravery on the front lines of the labor movement. The judge was particularly keen on learning why Hapgood, a Harvard graduate and a man of great intelligence, would spend his time working alongside laborers who had practically no education or cultural sophistication. Obviously bemused by this question, Hapgood responded, "Because of the Sermon on the Mount, sir." Vonnegut was particularly inspired by Eugene Debs's proclamation in solidarity with the working class. While there is a lower class, I am in it. While there is a criminal element, I am of it. While there is a soul in prison, I am not free. Vonnegut was impatient with a political economic system obsessed with profit, reaped from the labor of an entire class of subjugated people with a sociopathic indifference. In his inspired 1970 commencement address at Bennington College, Vonnegut told graduates to work within the system, but also to direct civilization in such a way that human beings might stop treating each other like garbage. In Jailbird, Vonnegut also writes extensively about the case of Sacco and Vanzetti, two labor organizers who, after upsetting one capitalist too many, were framed for murder. Their innocence was so obvious that many were shocked that they could have been found guilty on the trumped-up charges. They were executed in 1927, even after the actual murderer confessed to the crime. Vonnegut truly thought their deaths would be seen as a modern crucifixion. He expected the story of Sacco and Vanzetti to be retold as often as the story of Jesus Christ someday, but this was not to be. History's forgetting of the tragic case of Sacco and Vanzetti and society's failure to draw a lesson from it is part of the same tradition of forgetfulness that Labor Day and the labor movement generally finds itself in. It also speaks to the power of literature to rehabilitate such traditions, something Vonnegut never stopped striving for. Why consider the words of a fiction writer when considering history and politics? Why not consult a historian? 20th century German philosopher and literary theorist Walter Benjamin argued that there is no such thing as objective or ideologically resistant historicism. In his essay on the concept of history, Benjamin argued that all historical writing has the danger of becoming a tool of the ruling classes, because historicism inevitably sympathizes with the victor of history, that is, with the monarchs, the aristocracy, the bourgeoisie, and never with the working classes. The whitewashed history presented by sources such as the United States Department of Labor is a perfect example. Fiction writers like Vonnegut can be said to present something like a counter-history, where instead of objective facts, key moments are decided by monumental suffering, passion, woe, and struggles for justice. A counter-history is perhaps not as reliable as traditional historicism, but it also has much less potential to dip into banality or ideologies of power and exploitation. Vonnegut is by no means the only exemplar of this tradition, and many authors write masterfully in it. Faulkner's illustration of the interwar South, Steinbeck's writing of Western laborers, Joyce's poetic recreation of Ireland, Proust's depiction of high society France, Fitzgerald's account of the new American aristocracy, Virginia Woolf's interrogation of British collective psyche, Garcia Marquez's mythological and magical retelling of the story of Colombia, and Murakami's similar endeavor in Japan are just some other examples of how this tradition is carried out. This Labor Day, 2022, comes close to the 59th anniversary of the March on Washington and Martin Luther King Jr.'s I Have a Dream speech. 59 years on, Dr. King's goals have not been fully realized, and it is up to the labor movement to help further those goals. The March on Washington was not just the demand for racial equality, but also one for economic justice. Protesters carried signs declaring, "We march for higher minimum wages, coverage for all workers. Civil rights plus full employment equals freedom. We march for jobs now, decent pay for all. We demand decent housing now." Labor was central to their civil rights protests. In 1963, the year of the March on Washington, the unemployment level was 10.8% for Black people and 5% for white people. In 2012, it was 12.6% for Black people and 6.6% for white people. It is entirely appropriate at this moment in history to revitalize that once proud American tradition of the labor movement that flowed through so many. In an article in the UU World written by UUA President Susan Frederick Gray just last April, she writes that the UUA unequivocally sides with the inspiring labor resurgence happening in workplaces across the country. As Unitarian Universalists, we have long believed that challenging inequity locally and globally for workers is a moral imperative. The labor movement is critical to creating an economic system that is fair and that addresses the economic injustices we know have been experienced. In 2000, we adopted a statement of conscience on economic inequality and another statement of conscience in 2017 on a similar issue. And just last year, our General Assembly passed an action of immediate witness on the COVID-19 pandemic, understanding that our commitment to justice, equity, and compassion calls on us to join with people fighting for a more fair economy. Since then, we have shown up at the Poor People's Campaign Actions with Service Employees International Union, that's SEIU. UUs continue to organize for passage of the PRO Act. PRO is an acronym for Protecting Our Right to Organize, which would protect and expand a union's capacity for collective bargaining. Our work is far from over. Across the country, we see continued attacks on the right to organize, which violates UU principles around interdependence and the inalienable rights inherent in the democratic process. And so, we must act to protect workers, to create a more just economic system, and to ensure the rights of all. Supporting legislation like the PRO Act is one way to get involved. Another is to lend our voices to efforts like the unionization of Starbucks. At my last count, the last time I was noticing, there are about 40 unionized Starbucks shops across the country, and growing. It's growing fast. Today, we are witnessing a growing labor movement built by and for working class people that is pushing back against the system of exploitative capitalism. Poverty is a policy choice. Together, we can pass legislation that honors workers' dignity. An economic system that produces record profits during the COVID-19 pandemic while plunging millions more people into poverty is immoral. 64% of people in the United States live paycheck to paycheck. Working class Americans pay a higher tax rate than billionaires, and they suffer under a political economy that prioritizes profits over people. As people of faith and conscience, we rejoice in recent historic wins for workers at Starbucks and Amazon facilities, including successful unionization efforts. This is the righteous work of people joining together across differences to demand dignity, safety, and justice. As Unitarian Universalists, we affirm the practice of democracy in our institutions. This is what democracy looks like. To those on the picket line, we say, strike, huelga. To those fired from their jobs for union organizing, know that we are with you. Okay, I hope I've been able to light a fire under you today. Your charge is to take what you learned about Labor Day and the Unitarian Universalist values you heard from the words of Reverend Frederick Gray and combine them into an action plan, and I can help you. She spoke to our first, second, fifth, and seventh principles that we affirm and promote the inherent dignity, worth and dignity of every person, justice, equity, and compassion in human relations, the right of conscience and the use of the democratic process within our congregations and in society at large, and respect for the interdependent web of existence of which we are all a part. It's a big jump to digest. Don't you? I want to tell you the story of my own union journey. I work in the kitchen of Liberty High School, one of two public high schools in Bethlehem. I'm starting my 6th year at that school, and before that, I worked in the kitchen at Easton Area High School doing the same kind of work. Through a set of circumstances that I don't completely understand, the kitchen workers in Easton lost their union membership just before I was hired permanently. Thus, I've experienced the same industry with and without a union. Maybe you just have to experience and be able to tell it, but the differences are stark. The most obvious difference is in pay and benefits. My salary went up by almost 50% when I was hired permanently by the Bethlehem School District. I got paid sick days, so I didn't have to choose between working sick or losing my pay. I got paid holidays. I got a contract specifying what I can expect my employers to do and what I could expect from them, and what they could expect from me. Maybe most importantly, I got a level playing field where my position in the pecking order is determined by how well I do my job and how long I've been there, rather than how well somebody likes me. If there's extra work to do, and the extra hours that go with it, that means more money. Who gets this work is decided by seniority, again, without regard for having pleased the right people. When I fell down a flight of stairs and broke my left wrist, my immediate supervisor in Easton worried that I would be fired because surely I would have to be away from work for a long time. I was back at the job 13 days after my accident because I was afraid too. A broken bone takes about 12 weeks to heal. I was able to take off less than 2. I couldn't hold a pencil with my left hand. I'm left-handed. So I couldn't write I had to write with my right hand. I learned to be a cashier under those circumstances because at least I wouldn't have any heavy lifting to do. So I wrote with my right hand for a couple of months. I worked through considerable pain. I did a really lousy job, and I really appreciated my coworkers who helped me with all the things that I couldn't do. A few months after my full recovery, I was leaving work when I was suddenly overcome with a feeling of despair. Was this really what had become of my life? Was working under conditions of threat and condescension, constantly on the lookout for workplace favorites and for an insultingly low rate of pay, really the best I could do? It didn't take me very long to decide to pursue a union job. The Bethlehem area school district kitchens were unionized, and although their shifts were shorter, which means less money, less hours always means less money, and the work commute was 3 times as long, all the advantages I've spoken of were mine for the taking. I just had to make the necessary break with the present. It was difficult handling a resignation letter to the supervisor who had helped me through the broken wrist crisis, but I've never looked back or regretted the move. I'm still not crazy about being hot all the time, which I am at work. I'm not crazy about working under a lot of pressure, which I always am, or routinely lifting heavy things. And my coworkers occasionally crack and are less than their best selves, as am I. But we like and respect each other. We help each other. We laugh and tell jokes. We cooperate to solve problems, and we do very good work. There's much less looking out for coworkers undermining and cleaner communication generally, which makes for healthier working conditions. I should also let you know, 4 years after I broke my wrist, I broke my arm at the union shop, and I was able to take the full healing time that I need, all paid, except for about a week and a half, because I had sick days. I had paid sick days accrued that I could use for that. There was never any question of my coming back before I was healthy. I am the secretary for my local, which is 391B, which is all of the Bethlehem school kitchens. I have friends in the Allentown school kitchens who are represented by the same union, Workers United. That's the union behind the unionization of all those Starbucks that you hear about. I can't even tell you how proud I am to be a part of this movement in labor history. This is as we the people as it gets. Like the anthem we heard before, which side are you on? I am very clear which side I'm on. And I'm like one of my heroes, John Lewis, said, let the workers organize. The future of labor is the future of America.